Okay, so welcome everyone. This is, in fact, the monthly meeting of Los Angeles Audubon Society, and as I've mentioned to those of you coming in, we have a substitute program tonight, um, which, because I organize the programs uh, and uh, and had the cancellation, I just slotted myself in here to talk about some of my own research. And hope everybody is interested and excited to hear a little bit about light pollution. So what I'm going to do here, um, I should mention that if you heard about this through our mailing list, that's great. You should have gotten an update about the program change if you did that way. If you are interested in being on our mailing list, you can go to laaudubon.org, and at the bottom of about every page on that website, there is a subscribe button. And so you can toss your email in there and get notices of events. Um, then we also have other events, in-person events, the bird walks and occasional field trips that are also on the calendar on the website, and you can keep track of those and participate in them as we go forward. Um, so tonight, I hope my connection, so I'm getting like some yellow bars here as opposed to green. So if I freeze up, somebody let me know and put it in the chat. We do have the chat open tonight. You can put your name and maybe where you're from in there if you'd like, just to say hi to the other folks who are here tonight. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Um, see if this works. So can I confirm with somebody that you're seeing World Migratory Bird Day? And do you
Yes,
see stuff
we
behind
can
it,
see.
or you just that's filling the whole screen? Great. Right. So the reason I thought it might be appropriate, first of all, for Ryan's talk that was going to be tonight about Bear Divide, um, was this Saturday, the 14th, is in fact World Migratory Bird Day, which is it happens twice a year, once for the Northern Hemisphere, once for the Southern Hemisphere, and really celebrates and draws attention to migratory birds and this process that connects places together, countries together, uh, across great distances. And the theme this year, which why I didn't feel too bad about selfishly putting my own work in here to talk about tonight, is the theme for World Migratory Bird Day this year is dim the lights for birds at night. And so really there's a focus on the effects of light on migration and on migratory birds. And although I'm not going to talk about migration too much, I can a little bit if you're interested in some details about that later on, because I have done some other research on light impacts on birds during migration. But I want to talk about lights and birds here in Southern California, and we're going to toss a fish in here as well. So World Migratory Bird Day has lots of materials. If you go to the website worldmigratorybirdday.org, all sorts of different languages, all sorts of different outreach materials, coloring exercises. They've really gone to good development of materials to get the word out about the impacts of light at night and migratory birds. And you can see this outline here that may be familiar of birds at night. And the lights of North America and South America here on the screen. And it's sponsored by many different organizations. Environment for the Americas is one of the main sponsors, and they're very active in cross-boundary conservation issues and bird conservation issues. And they also have internships, and we at LA Audubon have hosted another number of interns focused around international conservation, especially with the Spanish-speaking world, in the Americas here, in our education programs here at LA Audubon in the Baldwin Hills in our greenhouse programs. And so it's Environment for the Americas. CMS is the Convention for Migratory Species, which is a treaty of the UN. The United States isn't a member of this treaty, unfortunately, but we can participate with them. The U.S. Forest Service, the Audubon Society, National Audubon Society, and then government agencies, the Smithsonian, BLM, Park Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, et cetera, all participating in Migratory Bird Day to raise awareness of conservation of migratory birds. And so our topic here tonight is, and this, I can't take credit for this title because it came from Levi Simons, who's a lead on this work. He was a PhD student and then postdoc who worked with me on this research called Light Dark Birdfish, the biological impacts of artificial light at night on the California coast. And we did this work also with Karen Martin, who's a professor now emeritus at Pepperdine University and the world's leading California Grunion expert. And this sort of came about just as a bit of backstory. I've worked on the effects of light pollution for many years now, and had this idea that beaches might be a very interesting place to investigate the impacts of light at night. And applied for and eventually got some funding through a program that's called the Sea Grant, which is from NOAA, the U.S. National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, Sea Grant at USC, to do this project looking at light along the Southern California coast. And so Levi was actually a fellow under the Sea Grant as a grad student, and was able to do this work as part of his time as a PhD student at the University of Southern California, where I was at the time that this started. And so we looked at beaches because my perception was that beaches in California can be very bright. This is a nighttime picture out on Dockweiler, right near the Plover exclosure. If any of you have been out to that location to do surveys or look at the snowy plovers, and this is during a new moon night, and all that light is from our city and our infrastructure there on the coast. And the coastal context here is also really important in California because we have a special agency that's dedicated to protecting the resources of the coast, the biological resources of the coast, the California Coastal Commission. And the California Coastal Commission and its long interest in light at night actually sort of is part of the origin story for how we got this work going in the first place. Because back in the early 2000s, if you look at the date here of this staff report, this was a proposal to light the Vincent Thomas Bridge down in the port of Los Angeles with, as you can see there, 8 7,000 watt fixed pencil beam xenon lights and 12 200 to 1100 watt floodlights. And just to give you a sense of, these would have been pointed straight up into the sky, which means, and some of our astronomer friends calculated at the time, you would have been able to see the Vincent Thomas Bridge from the moon as a point source if you'd been up there and looking at the dark side of the Earth at the time. With the naked eye, it would have been that bright. This was of interest. My wife and at the time partner, Catherine Rich, had been working on this topic in grad school a bit, and we'd collected a bunch of information about the impacts of light at night, and she had gotten a call from I won't call him a whistleblower, but a concerned state agency person, that putting this much light on a bridge was going to have impacts to migratory birds. And in fact, it would have. And we brought to the attention of the California Coastal Commission that this project, which was a public art project, and it was in light installation, would have needed this coastal development permit because it wasn't part of the local planning at the time. Coastal Commission agreed, they took jurisdiction over the project, and they actually rejected this project. And it was the first time that the California Coastal Commission had ever counted the disruption of the nocturnal environment by light as a significant impact on coastal zone resources. And that led to a much modified project, which were these little blue tracer lights on the bridge that you will see there today. That was what would happen after we got the lights that would have shined straight up at the moon rejected by the Coastal Commission. And so the Coastal Commission has, since that period and over the years, has taken an active role in suggesting and implementing lighting regulations as part of the local coastal plans that all coastal areas in California are supposed to develop. And so this is I felt was a interesting and important area to research. And the question that we have today on beaches, because now there's we know that perhaps there's these impacts of lighting to birds because we've measured all of that. The question is, how much light is too much on a beach? And that was a question that we didn't have an answer to. How do we know the thresholds for impacts of light at night? This is just a picture of Chicago. Chicago, for those of you who know it, is a very, very, I will use the term overlit city. There was a decision made many years back about how much light there would be, and it's a lot. It's like 4 times the amount of light in Chicago as there is in Berlin, and Berlin is the same population. So just to give you a sense globally how much light we sometimes put into our cities in North America. And there's a rather famous long-term study of bird attraction and mortality at the Natural History Museum, the Field Museum in Chicago, documenting the impacts of that light on birds, which are attracted to the lights first and then run into the windows of buildings after the attraction. But we look at beaches and we think, okay, if there's an impact, how do we know what those thresholds might be? And we didn't at this point. And the other question is, how do we measure light for analysis? We have satellites. This is a satellite image. We have aerial photos like this one I just showed you. We actually have some images from the International Space Station, but it wasn't clear how we would go about at a regional scale to understand how to measure light for analysis. So these were the 2 questions that we were going to deal with the idea that if we have these sensitive species on our Southern California beaches, California Grunion being one and snowy plovers being another, how would we go about doing this? We have another tool that's out there that any of you who are interested in looking at can see. It's called the World Atlas of Artificial Night Sky Brightness, and it maps light pollution around the world based on satellite information and the scattering of that light in the atmosphere. Because when you go out to, say, if you're in LA, you look up, you don't see many stars, and that's because all the light here on the ground also scatters up in the atmosphere, and it reduces the contrast between the stars and the background, and so you can't see them because they're being washed out by that light. And so this atlas is a global tool that maps the amount of light sort of straight up everywhere around the globe. And so, hold on, there we go. So we have another way outside of this, satellite data to measure light at night, which is what we did on the beaches. And this is Levi, who led this work on the right, and this is Ben, one of my former students, who now works with the National Park Service in their night skies work out of Fort Collins, Colorado. And this tool is called a sky quality camera. It's basically a digital single lens reflex camera that has a special lens on it that is hemispherical. So we can take a picture when we point it straight up like you're seeing there. We point it straight up, we point the top of the camera to the north, and we can take a picture that gets the entire hemisphere of the night sky and the horizon. And so this has been out on the beach in Santa Monica, but I'll just show you where we went out to take these measurements first. We looked at basically the beach, the sandy beaches in Ventura County, Los Angeles County, and Orange County. And you can see they have a highly variable illumination. The color scheme here has to do with that world atlas that I just showed you, the calculating from the satellites how much light pollution there is. So we think, according to satellites, this should be a full gradient of brightness, the brightest areas being down near the port of Los Angeles, which is extremely bright, Los Angeles and Long Beach, and the darkest areas being sort of outer Malibu and the northern portions of Orange County. So if you take one of those images, it looks like this. And this is actually in a relatively dark place for Southern California. This was taken out on Anacapa Island. And what happens, you look straight up, top of the sky is there. The entire distance around the circle are the horizon. And this is, I showed you this so that you can get a sense of how much we can detect with these cameras. You know, obviously you can see the Milky Way. It's not washed out by the light pollution quite yet if you're out there on Anacapa. And then the lights here are the lights of Malibu and Ventura at the top of this image. And that really bright white thing down at the bottom is actually a single squid boat. And the squid fishery here in Southern California, they use lights that they shine into the water to get the squid to come up, and then they take another boat and a net that they encircle the squid and capture them that way. So it's a light-induced fishery. It's extraordinarily bright, and this is actually another potential future research topic of the impacts of those lights on the birds of the Channel Islands National Park, because those squid boats line up right alongside the national park exclusion zones, and it's bright enough that it dramatically increases the illumination at some of the key seabird nesting locations. But I digress a little bit, but there's very important bird conservation tie-in to that image. So if we understand this now, this is a picture of the entire hemisphere of the sky. The ground or the ocean is all around the edge, and the middle is straight up. And we take this and we pull it into some software, and out of that we can calibrate and describe how bright the sky is in different portions. And the reason that we can do this is there's been developed this software, and the camera was sent to the software developer in Slovenia in Europe, who is the one guy who does this, and he calibrates the lens and the camera and the software together, and that lets us know with a high degree of confidence how bright these different parts of the night sky are, and it allows us to say how much light is coming into any one point. This happens to be, notwithstanding where you can see those bright spots on either on the land or that squid boat that we were looking at, on the left-hand side is the brightness. The right-hand side has to do with the spectrum of the light, and it's something called the correlated color temperature. And it's worth knowing about this. It basically says how much blue or yellow is in the light. So a high correlated color temperature has a lot of blue in it. A low one has a lot of yellow and red in it. And you can see here that white light in the sort of lower right side, around 210 to 240 degrees, if you're looking at the numbers around that circle, that was that squid boat. And you saw that was a very bluish looking light, a very white light. That's a very high color temperature if you look on the right-hand side. Whereas the lights on the shore were sort of a lower color temperature. They were much more yellow, and that shows up on the circle on the right. So basically, we can gather all this information about the lights on the beaches using this camera, and start to describe it and create a map essentially of how much light there is on the beach to test against these the responses of different organisms that we find there. And so this is a map, and I shouldn't just sort of gloss through the fact that in between sort of having the idea of going out to these spots, Levi and his team that included undergrads and high school students and friends and sometimes probably family, they went out over the course of a year and visited 515 spots along the beach and took these photographs on the using this camera. And then we brought this all back into the lab and analyzed it, and we could then take all those points and line them up. And this is the SI is the scalar illuminance, so the total amount of light coming into an individual point along the Southern California coast at those 515 points that represent the full variation of light brightness. That wasn't quite enough to describe it, and so we also used some tools that model the landscape in 3 dimensions, and figured out how much basically the deal was that there are places where the bluffs are blocking the light of the city a bit, and they make it darker than it would be otherwise. Because we wanted to be able to extrapolate from the satellite data that we have everywhere down to any individual point to create a continuous map of light pollution conditions all the way from Ventura County to Orange County. And just knowing the relationship between the satellite data and our measurement on the ground wasn't quite enough. We had to add in this piece that took into account how much shading we got from bluffs. So this is a nerdy spatial thing that you don't have to worry too much about, but suffice to say, it's basically a tool. We have these very highly detailed maps of the topography, and that comes from data that are collected by our U.S. Agencies, NOAA in particular. And if we add that in to the satellite data, we can come up with a pretty solid relationship between our measurements, which are the scalar illuminance, and the World Atlas, which is the satellite data. And we put those together, and we can create a map of light pollution conditions all along those several hundred kilometers of coast. Clouds do matter here. I should mention this. The more clouds you have, generally, the brighter it is. And so some of these dark dots that had a lot of clouds are high up and sort of off the line here. And that's because clouds, when you're close to light sources, reflect the light. But then when you're far from light sources, they actually they sort of obscure the light. But there is a factor in there, but it doesn't affect the overall relationship too much. So we established this relationship between how a satellite sees light at night from the coast and then actual measurements at 515 places along the coast, and create maps that are a model of light exposure. And so this little narrow band is the band that we mapped. And the variations of gray are how bright it is. It's very bright in the port. It's darker here as you get along the Palos Verdes Peninsula. And if you're like right up against the cliff, it's darker. And so that's what this topography shows us there. But we do this, and now we have it for this whole several hundred kilometers set of coast. And then we apply it to these 2 species. And the first one's California Grunion. And I know some of you already have gone out on Grunion runs and caught Grunion, or maybe just gone to look at them over the years in Southern California. So Grunion are fascinating. They spawn on the beach. They come right up on the beach either during the full moon or the new moon when the tide is highest. They get really high up in the top of the intertidal zone. The females wiggle their back ends down into the sand, and the males then fertilize eggs that they put into the sand. And so it's new moon and full moon. And there was some evidence in the literature when we set out on this project that they avoid excess light, that they're sort of spooked away by too much light. And they're also a regulated species, meaning that you can't take too many of them, and they're interesting and important from a conservation perspective. And also, they're kind of iconic, the Grunion runs. And the second species we looked at, of course, were western snowy plovers. And snowy plovers roost on beaches in Southern California during their wintering season. If it were not for all of the disturbance on our beaches, they would be breeding here. They did breed here, and they have recently tried to breed here and nest here again, based on conservation efforts of the sort of network of Audubon chapters, LA Audubon, Santa Monica Bay Audubon, and chapters down into Orange County, trying to set aside areas for plovers and indeed to encourage them to stay and nest, which they did historically, and they have recently attempted again. But they're listed under the Endangered Species Act, and according to reading of the literature, they might avoid light pollution. And they're threatened. And so we want to figure out, is this a factor that we need to deal with if there's either for the wintering birds that come down here, and there are many people who have participated in the surveys for these over the years and helped us with cleanups and fence repair and general snowy plover conservation efforts. And we can use them now. Do we need to be worried about light pollution as a factor? And the reason that light pollution might be bad for both of these species is light pollution tends to give, or excess light at night, tends to give an advantage to predators. And so they are both vulnerable prey species. And if there's an advantage to predators, that means they're going to suffer losses in what should, under normal circumstances, be a refuge for them, the darkness. And so the question here becomes, is this the case? So here are the data that went into this. This all came out of what we refer to as community science, which is people from the community participating, amateurs participating, educated by perhaps experts on what to look for, but folks volunteering and going out and tracking natural phenomena. And so there's a group that Karen Martin, our co-author at Pepperdine, leads, called Grunion Greeters. Perhaps she's even joined us tonight. That would be wonderful. And they have extensively surveyed the beaches of Orange, Ventura, and Los Angeles counties for Grunion runs, and documented them on what's known as the Walker scale. And the Walker scale basically is a sort of an ordinal scale of how many Grunion are on a beach in a particular night. And we took out of these data that came from 2013 to 2016, all of the ones that were more than just a few fish. So 1 on a Walker scale is pretty low. We took 2 to 5 and basically use these as the points to ask the question, what do these places have in common? Right? What are the things, what are the attributes of the environment that are associated with these points compared to what we call pseudo-absences, which are all of the places that don't have records of higher Walker scale Grunion runs up and down the coast. What do the green dots have in common that the brown dots do not? And this is sort of a statistical question that we do in environmental science. And then the other thing we have are these plover roosts, and this is also community science. These are surveys that have been done by well, actually here arranged. There's some that are from the military, some that are from volunteers up in Ventura County, others in LA County with volunteers from various Audubon chapters, coordination funded by the California Department of Fish and Wildlife via a grant from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, also funded, I should mention, by Disney, has helped fund some of these efforts. And we have all these purple sites are snowy plover roost sites. From 2013 to 2016. So Audubon chapters, U.S. Navy, and then various funding sources all aggregated together. And the question becomes, what do these purple dots have in common that these brown dots do not? So we're looking to find the differences, and we have to account for more than light pollution. And so without going into too much nerdy detail about the work that I do in the modeling, basically the idea is you have to figure out what are the things that are important to each of these species and account for them, find their similarities, and once you've accounted for that, how much impact does light pollution have, if any, and what does that impact look like? So just to give you an example, so this sort of summarizes these things. We have the western snowy plover sites in blue, we have the Grunion sites in yellow, and then these sort of long skinny things are just showing you what the layers are that we're trying to use to explain them. The scalar illuminance, that's the light pollution. You see it's very bright around the port, it's bright around Santa Monica, it gets darker out along the Malibu shore, brighter up into Ventura, same thing through Orange County and down to southern Orange County. And then there are a whole series of other layers, and I'm not showing them now, but like distance to fresh water, because we know from other research that plovers like to roost near fresh water. They like they're good foraging sites next to lagoons where fresh water is coming into the ocean. Those are really highly productive sites for plovers. And in fact, in the past, we've modeled plover distributions up in the Central California area, and so we know this to be the case. And there's a series of other things. The beach width is another one, and so we take these environmental layers, we put them together, and basically use what's called machine learning. So here we go. We have distance to freshwater, that sky view factor that I was talking about for whether or not it's shaded by the coast, the slope, the elevation, the beach type, how far to salt water for the plovers. That's how far you are into the coast. So we put these all in together, and I'll just cut to the chase here because there's a lot of numbers. For the Grunion, the most important thing in describing its distribution, at least when we put in all these variables, is the width of the beach and how bright it is. And we were talking about the plovers, it's the width of the beach, how close you are to freshwater, which we knew from before was very important, and how bright it is. This was really, and it turned out that the brightness was the single most important factor helping us understand where the Grunion were, and it was the second most important factor helping us understand where the plovers were. We didn't expect this. We thought that that lighting would be the third, fourth, fifth thing on the list in terms of importance. But when we ran it, I've skipped the whole long, boring statistical part to tell you how we got to this, but it turns out that it's very important in understanding these distributions. And so then what we do is we look and say, well, what is the relationship? If it's important to predict it, it says all these places have in common these things. What do those relationships look like? So this is for plovers, and this is brightness. And what I want you to see here is that as we are at the dimmer levels, there's sort of a higher numbers, which means a higher probability that we're going to find plovers. And as it gets brighter, there's a lower probability. And there's a threshold, it seems, that's maybe right about here. And it turns out that threshold is about the illumination that is produced by half of a full moon. And the thing that you should know is that that's light pollution on top of the natural variation from the new moon to the full moon, because we took all our measurements during the new moon when there's no lunar illumination at all. So basically what this tells us is that if you've got light pollution that's as bright as a half a moon on top of your normal variation in illumination from the moon, you're at that point, if you go above it, you're probably going to see reduced probability of use by plovers. And this was really important from a light pollution perspective, because now it lets us go back to people like the Coastal Commission, who are regulating development along the coast, and have a threshold and say, if there's a new application for a restaurant in Malibu, and they wanted to have a whole bunch of lights, and there's a nearby area that's a snowy plover beach, or frankly, any other shorebird beach, you can set a standard now and say that the lights from the uh, the the restaurant should not exceed, in this instance, it's 0.05 lux on the beach, because that's where we start seeing impacts on the distribution of shorebirds. The results from the Grunion were a little different. We found lower probability at the darkest beaches. We saw an increase up to right here, which is about 1/10 of a lux, and 1/10 of a lux is about the light from a full moon. Okay, and so a max there, and then as you get brighter than that, it starts to go off a little bit. I'm looking at this purple line here. And this was really interesting because it suggests that the distribution of these runs is actually being guided a bit toward places that have a bit of extra light. And this was not completely surprising, because there is a life stage for Grunion where they're a little bit attracted to lights. They will go toward lights as a juvenile fish. And so it is possible that our Grunion runs today are actually being influenced by where they are, by the lights that are on the beach, up to a certain point that they're attracted to lights. And then as you get beyond that, much brighter, you start to decrease your probability of finding those larger runs. So this gives us two thresholds that we can start to talk about, and it happened, and this wasn't guaranteed at the outset. It happened that these two thresholds, basically the light of a half a moon and the light of a full moon, were in that neighborhood of things that are natural phenomena, right? If you've got certain brightness, that if it had been, 6 times brighter than the full moon, that would have been a little bit of a difference. But it turns out that these two thresholds are within the natural range of variation of the lunar cycle, and led us to make some recommendations. So we have presented this work to the Coastal Commission, and we've published it as well. And I know that they are starting to take this and incorporate it into their recommendations for things like this, right? Which is, lighting up for no good reason, actually, apparently, a beach much brighter than these threshold levels. So we showed that we can model these exposures. We can show that there's thresholds for sensitive species that are at or below illumination of the full moon. There may be an influence of spectrum, and I'm working on this for other projects, and if you're really indulgent, I'll come back in a year and tell you about that. And that regulators can now set thresholds for performance of lights, rather than sort of generic recommendations that might be, oh, your lights should be directed downwards, or something like that, which tells you what to do but doesn't give you a performance level. If we can set performance levels for coastal development permits and sensitive habitats, which basically beaches are, we're more likely to be able to conserve the wildlife and birds especially that are using those beaches at night. So that's why I thought it was appropriate to substitute in here tonight and talk about dimming lights for birds at night, and just to talk a little bit about some of these others. Migrating passerines, songbirds, are highly impacted by light at night. They're attracted to light at night, as you saw last month if you came to the program. They collide with tall structures like communication towers, and they then are subject after being attracted to lights, to all the harms that come from being in urban areas, which means windows, which are collision hazard, pesticides, rodenticides, outdoor cats, you name it, is not a great thing. And that's why this all fits into dimming the lights for birds at night. And I would encourage you to go and visit migratorybirdday.org, and Migratory Bird Day being May 14th. They even have all these little pins that are ready to print out if you want to make pins or put this up on your socials or whatever you'd like to do, to just raise awareness about dimming lights for birds at night. And we also have an initiative right now to sign a petition to encourage the County of Los Angeles for its inland areas, which is the rural outdoor lighting ordinance in the County of Los Angeles, to improve and enhance and enforce its light pollution ordinance there. And as a result of some of that, and I want to thank folks, I've been approached and I'm in the process of trying to keep up with some conversations about whether we can do more in LA around this topic. What can we do more in terms of policy and advocacy to try to minimize the impacts that we have on our migratory birds to the extent that we can in a city that is, let's just say, highly oriented around entertainment and perhaps spectacle. So there'll be some balancing perhaps to be had there, but I'm confident that we can make things better, because making it better from where it is now, there are a lot of easy things that can be done to do that, even if we just start along the beach and get the glaring lights on the beach controlled, and then we'll work our way inland when it comes to those impacts. So with that, I'd like to I'll stop sharing my screen. At least I hope that's what's going to happen. And welcome. I haven't been able to follow along the chat or anything, and so I do see that Karen is here, Karen Martin, and would love to invite her to say a few words about the Grunion data and this research. Karen? You want to unmute?
Hard. Hi, can you hear me?
Hi, yeah, great.
This is all a new program for me. This is a great talk. Thanks, Travis. It's great to hear this explained again, and really interesting work. You did a great explanation, so I don't really have much to add, but just the point of Grunion recently have been recognized as being in a decline, and so there's a new regulations that are becoming into force in June to reduce the amount of recreational take of Grunion. And as far as the way that they're counted, there is really specific information available at the website that I've just put up in the chat. So I'm happy to answer any questions. My email address is on there. I don't want to take away from the birds, but thanks for this great talk.
We have plenty of room to care about Grunion and birds. Absolutely. There's a question in here, if you noticed, how much light was used for Grunion observation?
So we just use what light is available. Normally, you will see people out at Grunion runs with flashlights and headlamps and so on, but generally our Grunion greeters, we tell them to turn off their lights once they get where they're going and they don't need to see their feet moving on the beach anymore, just to let their eyes adjust. And I have been out on many new moon nights, and even in very dark beaches, it's possible that your eyes will adjust and you can see the little fish. If it's a really, really dark beach, yes, you need some artificial light to just help see, but we again encourage them to turn it off as quickly as possible, or alternatively cover it with a red filter so that the animals don't get disturbed by it.
Yeah. Very good. So great. So welcome anybody who has questions. Okay, cook them fresh. Okay, so we have Grunion recipes coming in the chat. Is there anyone on the call who's actually done any of the Plover surveys? Okay. How much does smoke from wildfires affect migration? Great question. I don't know the answer to that. I am unfamiliar with anybody doing it, but I can certainly look into it, and thank you for raising it. Any chances of working with Coastal Commission on working on red filters. Right. So red would be much better, especially along the coast. I think the way we get there is through, unfortunately, is going to be slow through incremental improvements um, and through both developments as they get proposed, and then also through um, agencies that might be willing to do something. So, for example, we know from the beaches that we've looked at that even though there's a significant impact from Los Angeles just being bright, if we could just control the lights that say LA County beaches and harbors has on the beach, and get them directed in the right way and get them filtered to the right spectrum. And when I say right spectrum, I could go on another hour on spectrum questions, but generally for wildlife, it's better to have the longer wavelengths of light, which are the yellows and the reds, as opposed to the shorter wavelengths of light, which are the blues and the violets and the ultraviolets. And so I think if we had agencies that were willing to do that, and then regulation as coastal development plans and local coastal plans are updated through engagement and cooperation, we can get these slowly improved. And the great thing about light pollution as a issue is that once you fix it, it's fixed. There's no remedial pollution, it's gone. Now, of course, the bad thing is that once you're past the big light users, like your agencies or Southern California Edison or whatnot, then there's thousands and actually millions of individual decisions that go into creating the light environment. So, okay, so are there snowy plover at Dockweiler Beach now? May. I'm not sure. They tend to be here for the winter, and I'm pretty sure we're in nesting season, so they're probably gone, but some of them may have stuck around. But I haven't been out. You could check recent eBird things there. Benjamin Hamilton talking about the Pacific Flyway, heavily impacted by human activities. Yes, absolutely. And we have a role to play here in minimizing that. Yeah, okay, so Kathy says there's a random distribution of camping sites on the beach, state, federal, city, county. I love access, but recognize the negative impact. Any chance that we can pull that into a rational system, some but not much access? I agree this is a challenge, and one of the mandates of the Coastal Act is in fact access. And so it is difficult to argue against access for the public. And I think there are probably some lower hanging fruit in terms of beach health that we could go after. So one of the things, for example, for plovers, is that the beach grooming that we do in terms of raking the beach and smoothing it out and taking away all the wrack, the driftwood and the seaweed and all of its flies is really bad for plovers. It's bad for shorebirds. It's bad for beach health. And I think we're starting to see the evolution of a more balanced practice. So, for example, there are beach restoration projects being led by it's the Bay Foundation, right? Santa Monica Bay Restoration Commission and the Bay Foundation at, say, for example, Santa Monica. And I believe there's some projects that are going to go on elsewhere where we get these exclosures, starting for plovers, but the development of an ungroomed piece of beach within these urbanized areas. The more we can have some ungroomed areas, the better off all of these shorebirds are going to be. And so it becomes a balance then between the human use of the beaches and the sort of sharing the shore with other species. And before I went after campgrounds, I would probably be trying to find quote unquote underused from a human perspective areas of beach and getting more of these natural beaches that allow for the development of rack and basically through that shorebird habitat. So Coastal Commission has some power over light. Does SMMC potentially have say over their jurisdiction? So SMMC, Santa Monica Mountains Conservancy. So Santa Monica Mountains Conservancy can make recommendations, but I do not believe they have any regulatory power over individual lighting projects, but they can incorporate this into their recommendations as a trustee agency as they review environmental documents. So that would be for the Conservancy. Okay, thank you, Philip, great question. Is there a preferred type of street light to optimize both efficiency and wildlife concerns? And I would argue, yes, there is. And so here, and there's trade-offs to be had in it though. So the first thing to know about this is that basically all street lights in this day and age are going to be LEDs. And there's a little bit of historical inertia in that the first economically viable LEDs were very high color temperature, which if you remember back to that color temperature slide means that they have a lot of blue light in them. This may come through the internet or not, and I actually have a lamp here that changes color temperature on it. So and let me turn off this other light. So I just turned this lamp to a very blue light on it, and that's a high color temperature. And if I change it, there's a little more lower, and you can see how I'm kind of getting yellower as it goes along, right? That's the difference. The best thing for wildlife in general is to have lower color temperatures. And that's because the majority of species have a lot of sensitivity in the shorter wavelengths, and especially insects in the blue and the violet and the ultraviolet. And humans and other primates, incidentally as well, tend to be focused a little bit toward the longer wavelengths. And most, or should I say more species that are active during the day have more visual receptors to detect the longer wavelengths. Like for example, butterflies detect light out in the red and the yellow and whatnot, whereas moths tend not to have any ability to detect in the longer wavelengths. So there's sort of difference between diurnal and nocturnal. And so in general, it's good to have fully shielded lights, meaning no light going up and also directing the light where it needs to go, and lower color temperatures. But there's a big caveat to this, which is bioluminescent organisms that like fireflies are absolutely hammered by yellow light because their visual systems are cued into those yellows and greens that we might want to use because that's where their signals are for their sexual communication. Okay, so that and I have to always put this caveat in because my colleagues who work on fireflies are like livid when I'm like, okay, the best thing is for low color temperature lights as a whole, and like, no, that's not good for my fireflies. And it's like, okay, I admit that. So if you got fireflies, you don't want to light their habitat up at all. And I think that should be pretty obvious to anybody who's had a firefly or collected a firefly or had it in a jar and knows what happens when you turn the light on. They stop flashing. So it should be pretty obvious that you want to keep the lights out of that habitat. We do have, just to Ben's question, we do have bioluminescent. We have glowworms in Los Angeles, and in fact, we've documented glowworms at the end of my street here in the Santa Monica Mountains. So there are bioluminescent organisms in LA and in the mountains. It's not fireflies, but they're related. So it's a great question because people don't tend to know that. So you have to balance all this against the safety issues that are very real. And so the safety issues, there is literature that suggests that if you can see color, you can better detect an obstruction that is on the highway in front of you or on the road in front of you. And the lower color temperature you have, because you're eliminating those blue wavelengths, it becomes more difficult to see some of the colors. And so there's pushback in the lighting engineering community to want to have sort of some higher color temperatures in order to see color. And so so how does this get worked out in practice? I was on a consulting team to the city of Salt Lake, and they wanted a new streetlight master plan. And they gave us some very clear goals, which were they wanted to be good for human health, they wanted to be good for wildlife, they wanted to be good for dark skies because there's a lot of tourism in Utah around dark skies. And it needed to sort of take into account all the concerns of the city. And so that meant people from transportation department, people from police and fire and whatnot. So there are a whole bunch of meetings, very intense meetings with different interest groups. And what we came to at the end was a recommendation that in commercial zones and residential zones, you would have a little bit higher color temperature, but not too high. And those of you who are interested in the details, we can talk about the numbers some other time. But I got them to all agree to, all the way across the board, and the city council approved it, that we would have these lower color temperatures, these more amber lights in the areas right next to, there's an important bird area right adjacent to Salt Lake City by the Great Salt Lake. And so any of the areas in the city that were designated as important for wildlife, their urban creeks and their areas adjacent to natural lands, they get a lower color temperature. So, and a provision in the plan to reduce the amount of light to what was best for the community, even as a balance between the visibility and the environmental impacts. So that was a long answer to something that I care a lot about. So thanks for asking the question. What is the complete address for eBird? eBird.org? Who has that handy? Should be. Plastics. Can you tell us a little bit about your bio? Thank you, Linda. Yeah, since I didn't introduce myself fully, here's where it goes. I have an undergraduate degree in geography from the University of Delaware. I grew up in Maine as the second son of two biologists. I left town and went to Delaware, and then I came to Los Angeles for grad school. So I have a master's and a PhD in geography from UCLA, where I minored in organismal biology for my PhD. And since that time, I've had academic and nonprofit positions at both UCLA and USC. And so I'm currently the president of LA Audubon. I'm the science director of a nonprofit called the Urban Wildlands Group that's dedicated to conserving wildlife in cities and raising awareness, especially this issue about light pollution. And I'm an associate adjunct professor in the Institute of the Environment and Sustainability at UCLA. So that's a little bit about my my bio. Thank you. Fireflies. Squid. Does squid boat lighting cause problems with migratory birds or birds in general? Great question. Squid boats attract a ton of birds. We don't know the level of their impact, though, because there's no monitoring program. And I know that they attract birds because as part of some of my work some years ago, I was introduced to a guy who, interesting character, he was both a PhD in genetics from Princeton back in the 60s or 70s, but he had left academia and been a squid boat captain for like 30, 40 years, and now was getting back and interested in people doing some research on squid. And so and he was a character, and we would have these conversations about what you actually see when you're out on a squid boat. And he's like, yeah, there's birds everywhere. Those lights attract birds. And but we don't know the magnitude, there's no monitoring, and it's kind of the Wild West out there. We have some anecdotal evidence that they influence the predation levels of the birds on Anacapa from the Park Service, that they were finding that the barn owls were being more efficient predators when the squid boats were next to the island, and that increased the predation rate for some birds that we are quite concerned about there. That's consistent with all of the published literature, but that itself wasn't published to my knowledge. Boats too, like even cruise ships and whatnot, end up attracting birds at night during migration, and so there's many instances out there, and you'll see them sometimes on maybe a YouTube or something where they claim it's 5G caused the birds to do this or that. It's not. Birds are attracted to the light. They end up on a boat. They run into the windows. And oftentimes on cruise ships, there are these accounts where the staff of the cruise ships will have to sweep the decks of the dead birds before the guests get up in the morning. Because of this, or the birds just are sitting there and hanging out on the ship. So ships in general have a significant, potentially significant role. We know it happens, but we don't have estimates of the magnitude of that issue like we do some of those. AB 2382, thank you, Frida, for that question. So this is a bill that was sponsored by Santa Clara Valley Audubon and International Dark Sky Association, et cetera. It's a California bill that would direct state agencies to turn off, basically have a lights out period during the night. There may be some amendments to that, which I haven't checked on recently, but it is an important step to demonstrate statewide that this is an issue of concern, and to have the state be a leader in demonstrating and showing the way, as it were, for folks on light pollution, taking action as a state legislature to say that this is important. And last month, I think I sent around some information to everyone on the mailing list about that bill and ways to get in touch, and we can follow up on that later. Kathy says, far from shorebirds, but have you looked at light on the delta? Can I ask, Kathy, which delta you're talking about? Sacramento Delta. Okay. I have not. We could, however, sort of assess that. We have light pollution data, satellite data, et cetera, for everywhere at a certain level, but I haven't specifically looked at that, and I don't know anybody who is right now. So lights are used to cause the squid to surface. That's absolutely right. They're all ready to breed, and that's when they grab them, and they're just attracted to the light. Come up there. So, wow. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. The Delta. Yes, there's a huge amount of politics around the Delta and what might happen. Yes. Yes, and the squid die after they breed. Yes, this is also, so they grab them right in advance of that. They're culminating right before they culminate their life's purpose, which is to create the next generation. We pull them out of there and process them up. The whole squid fishery is a fascinating thing because it's a closed fishery. There's a limited number of licenses for the whole state, and you have to buy a license to be, and there's a limited number of people who have those, like 100 of them. And yeah, so you like have to spend like $1 million to get a license or something. It's crazy. And there's also poaching that goes on. And we learned that when we were working on looking at the light distribution around the Channel Islands. And there's a satellite that goes over every night called VIIRS. And we can, and there was for a time, there's a group out of Colorado that was processing those data for individual points of light that weren't there. Basically, they're not stable lights, and they're suspected boats. And so remember I was telling you about my squid boat captain colleague, retired squid boat captain colleague. He would sometimes text me at like 1 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday and say, "Did you get it? Did you get it?" I'm like, "Get what?" He's like, "Look at the data for the backside of Santa Cruz Island, because they're not supposed to be fishing on the weekends. The squid fishery is closed on the weekends." And what he was meaning was he would have been out there scoping something out. There were people, squid boats set up on the backside of the island so they weren't visible from the mainland. And the squid boat would be set up and poaching on the weekend. But we could see it and document it using the satellite that goes over in the middle of the night. And so it's a very interesting issue, and as Ben points out, there's a lot of money involved there. So great. So we're 8:38 here. I really appreciate y'all sticking around for a program that wasn't the one that was advertised. I want to thank Karen for coming and all the other familiar names that I'm seeing as I look down the list here. We'll go ahead and thank you and close out the Facebook broadcast, and then we can stick around and chat a little bit more if you'd like. But thank you for coming tonight. Goodbye, everybody over on Facebook.